So we're going to look through a lot of the terminology now and ideas that we need to cover in chapter 3, which is all about migration. And so we're going to get into migration and look at that right now with this presentation. I'm likely going to divide this one up into 2 sections because it's a pretty long PowerPoint. And so I'll make it 2 a little bit more manageable sections. First off here, you see a picture of Ellis Island. One thing about AP Human Geography, AP doesn't set a clear order for schools to follow about what classes you're supposed to take in what order. And so you guys are taking, many of you, almost all of you, are having your first AP experience in AP Human Geography, which in my opinion is a great place to start. It's a perfect one to take as a freshman. Other students, like the students at Cherry Creek High School, they actually take this class as seniors and they take US history as freshmen. We do that class as juniors, and students all over the country go in different orders. And so occasionally there's going to be content that other students have already covered that you need to at least be aware of. And particularly what that's going to come up with is with history topics like US history or world history, and Ellis Island is a good example of that. So I just wanted to mention that Ellis Island is this place where immigrants were processed that came into the United States for huge sections of American history. I know my family that moved here from Europe in the late early 1900s moved through Ellis Island. Likely the spelling of our last name, Ketterland, which is not a common spelling that you'll find in France, where my people with that name had come from, that spelling was likely changed on Ellis Island when they came through and were processed there. This is in New York City. It's very close. If you've been to New York City before, you often do Ellis Island tours as a part of the tour that also goes to the Statue of Liberty. And so many of the tours, the 2 stops that you go are the Statue of Liberty and then Ellis Island. Today, immigrants are no longer processed here. Today, it's a museum that celebrates this history. But migration to the United States has been a part of the history of the United States since that history really started. All right, we're going to look through migration now. We're going to start with some quick review, and I'm going to go through this. I won't rush, but I'll go through this relatively quickly. But a lot of the ideas with diffusion, we think about those ideas as dealing with migration. When people migrate, they have their ideas and their beliefs and their culture diffused with them. And so just a quick review on culture. We talked about hearth. This is that port of origin for diffusion. So the hearth of a fireplace is where then the heat then diffuses from that point throughout the rest of the room or the house. And I put a picture of Hollywood here too. That's a point of origin for a lot of our popular culture. For our videos and movies, a lot of them are created in Hollywood. So that would be considered a hearth for that type of culture as well. For the types of diffusion, again, this is a review, so I would make sure that your notes are accurate for this information. We have the 2 categories for diffusion. One, we have the relocation diffusion. And this is really what we're going to talk about when we look at migration. So when people move, they take their new ideas with them to a new place. And so with migration, you're going to find a lot of relocation diffusion. We also have those expansion diffusions types, and that's when people stay in the same place, it's the ideas that move. So we have hierarchical as one type of expansion where powerful, important people like the Pope of the Catholic Church or a famous movie star does something, creates a trend that then spreads through the population from that point of power. Compare that to contagious diffusion, where we have the same type of viral spread, but we don't need a person of power or influence spreading that idea. So a YouTube video becomes viral because it's so funny. That could be contagious diffusion, even if the video was not made by anyone that's famous or a trendsetter or important. And then the final one is that stimulus diffusion. That's when the idea continues to move even though the original means get stuck. And so I use that TiVo example. Very few people today have a TiVo box on top of their television, but almost everyone has that ability to record live television, which was first innovated by TiVo. Just like most of you don't have the old click wheel iPod, but most of you do listen to digital music. All right, well, we're going to get a bunch of migration terms out of the way right now. And most of these are terms that you hopefully will have some familiarity with. So we're going to go through these terms, knock these out. These are quite a few of your key terms on your slides for chapter 3. So as I was doing this, I would pause and make sure I'd filled in those terms correctly and knock those out right as you go through this presentation. The first one we're going to look at is immigration versus immigration. They're pronounced the same, but one has an E and one has an I. And the key idea here is we're talking about the same people. It's where they're coming from and going to. And so if someone moves from Mexico to the United States, they have immigrated with an E from Mexico and they've left. So it's people that have left an area have immigrated with an E. Someone that's then come to the United States has become an immigrant with an I to that area. So immigration with an E are people that are leaving an area, and I are the immigrant place that they've come to. So when I left Missouri, I was an immigrant with an E from Missouri, and an immigrant with an I to Colorado. The next distinction that we need to make, and a lot of these are just making distinctions between critical terminology for Chapter 3. The next distinction we need to make is between refugees and migrants. Migrants are people that have chosen to move for all kinds of different reasons. Refugees are people that have been forced to move. So their choice to move was not made of their own choice. They've decided this has been a choice that's been made for them. And there's numerous reasons why people could be refugees. Refugees could be created through political conflict. Refugees can be created through civil war and violence. And also we can see refugees, that term was used for people who were forced to leave a place like New Orleans following Hurricane Katrina. You can become an environmental refugee. I imagine, unfortunately, that in places like California now, there might be some environmental refugees where their houses have been burned in the terrible wildfires, and they are on the move, not through their own choice. Similar to this idea is the second way, and this is mostly probably just ways to describe these previous terms, but you can also hear about a forced migrant versus voluntary migration. So voluntary migration is you're trying to improve your condition, or you want to move for reasons that are your own and of your own making, versus you being forced to move because of war or violence or threats of violence or environmental disasters in your area. Long-term versus short-term migration is another key observation that we need to make about migration. Way too often when we look at migration, we tend to just focus on the long-term aspects, the people that pack up and move and then stay in that new place for the rest of their lives. Short-term migration is also a really important part of the story, particularly when we look at groups. A lot of you will become short-term migrants when you go to college, because you'll go back and forth from college to your parents' homes. And we have lots of other people that work in seasonal agriculture and in many other jobs that also are short-term migrants. And that is something, aspect of migration we want to make sure we're familiar with. We've got international versus internal migration. So internal migration, you're migrating within the same country or state. We'll call them states when we get to Unit 3. And international migration, you're going to a new country. One that we, again, often overlook. When you hear that migration or immigration is our topic, people tend to just focus on international migration, people from moving from one country to a different country. But internal migration is actually a much bigger part of migration if you tell the overall story and pattern of migration. I would guess if we just polled our classroom, you're going to find almost everyone has moved internally, and you're going to find the number of international migrants is going to be much lower than the number of internal migrants. The next idea we have are push versus pull factors. These are two very important terms when we talk about migration. And I love these terms because they just tell you exactly what it is. So push factors are all the factors that would push you to leave your home and go to a new location. If you're going to immigrate with an E, you've been influenced by push factors. And these can be, like we've talked about before, they could be economic, they could be political, they could be cultural, and they could be environmental. I don't like the cold weather here in Colorado. I want to leave. I don't like these forest fires and dry conditions. I want to leave. I can't make enough money here. I don't like the peers in my area, and so I want to leave this area. Compare that or contrast that, if you want, with pull factors. These are the things that are attracting you to a new location. So if you don't like it in Colorado because it's too cold and you are pulled to the desert in Arizona where it's much warmer, then the pull factor is what's going to get you to your new destination. You might have chosen to leave because of the environment, that's your push, but then you picking your new location is a factor of your pull. And for all of you, when you make your college decision, push and pull factors are going to factor into that equation. Once again, just like I said with push factors, pull factors can include environmental, cultural, economic, and political factors could all influence and pull you to a new destination. On the next one, we have interregional versus intra-regional. And I believe this is the first time we're going to introduce these prefixes. These are prefixes that are going to come up with a few different terms over the course of the year. So you'll want to just commit these to memory. Inter means between two things, and intra means within. And so the way I always remember it, when I went to college, I played intramural sports. I played sports against other members within my university. Whereas when I was in high school, I played scholastic sports. And so my high school played competitions with other high schools. We had competitions between different high schools. So if you have an interregional move, you're going to move from one region to another one. You move from Missouri, like I did, the Midwest, to the Rocky Mountains in Colorado. That's an interregional move. Intra-regional move is when I moved from Denver to Aurora. More recently, my wife and I moved from Denver to Aurora. That would be considered an intra-regional move because we moved within this Rocky Mountain region. Okay, some other big ideas about migrations. Hopefully you're good on all of that terminology. Now we're going to get into some additional ideas about migration. One of the big patterns that we can associate with migration in the United States is a migration trend from the Rust Belt, and we can see our Rust Belt portrayed right here. Rust Belt is this area in orange, to the Sun Belt, and you can see the Sun Belt here, this area in red. So we've seen a lot of migrants leave this area in the Northeast. This was an area that was heavily populated due to industry. We in part call it the Rust Belt because a lot of that industry is now no longer needed and it's becoming rusted out, and a lot of these areas are no longer producing the same goods that they had in the past, and now more people are moving to this Sun Belt, which incorporates the whole south of the United States and even up into the West Coast, and I would include Colorado as a part of this Sun Belt as well. Whole areas, Utah, Colorado, I would include in this Sun Belt region. This is a region that has benefited from nice weather. It's a region that has benefited from relatively low rates for things like housing, and so you can go and find housing, and businesses have found that they can find lots of able workers in this area. And so we've seen a big relocation to this area. And remember, air conditioning is going to tell a part of the story. As we can make areas like Texas and Florida and Arizona more comfortable for citizens, they're going to want to go settle in those areas. So one big trend we've seen is movement from the Rust to the Sun Belt. The next big thing that we've seen is the movement of our center of population. So we're going to try this out. I'm going to see if I can get this video to play in my video. It's a very short minute and a half. We'll talk about this, and this will be the end of part one of these videos. We'll make two different videos on these notes on migration. And so if the video doesn't work, in the beginning of part two, I can get you a link and show you where to go to watch the video. But I'm thinking this is going to work. It seemed like it was going to work before. So let's just try and play this real quick minute and a half video about the center of population, which is an idea or a term that you should be familiar with. Make this full screen, and here we go. We'll give it a shot.
If you were to take a big, flat, rigid map of the United States and rest it on something sharp and pointy, and if every person in the United States weighed the same, the mean center of population is exactly where that map would balance. The census comes out with this figure every 10 years. It seems meaningless on its surface, but really that one little point carries in it a lot of information about how our population is moving. The first mean center of population was in Kent County, Maryland. In the 1800s, when the U.S. was adding on states all the time and people were moving out west all the time, the centers fed west. A big influx of European immigrants to the Northeast, plus movement of Southern blacks to the north in the early 1900s put on the brakes. Tacking on Alaska and Hawaii later in the century, it started to pull it out west a bit more, but also it started to move south a bit, particularly in recent years. Part of that is because of a booming Latino population in the Southeast and in Texas, and part of that is economic factors, like the growth of the Texas oil industry. One other thing, air conditioning. The growth of air conditioning, some experts say, has made the South more livable. Today, the mean center is just near Plato, Missouri, which in 2010 had just 109 people. So though that's the center of population, it's not at all a population center.
Okay, so that video points out the changes that we see in population over time. And so that we'll see where migration has taken people, and you can see that trend of people moving from the Rust Belt to the Sun Belt in that change in the center population. And then obviously you can see the change of people continuing to settle and more settlers in the western part of the United States. All right, we'll stop here and we'll pick up the second video. We'll cover the rest of the information you need on these notes on migration.